heard one of the greatest cellists that ever lived demonstrate one of the best spiccatos you're ever likely to hear. That was Emanuel Feuermann with a brief example from the Popper spinning song. I thought I'd talk about spiccato today because, in my experience, it's often a stumbling block for many students. And in fact, as a teacher, when I first started teaching, it was a stumbling block for me as well, and I found myself not being terribly effective in explaining the basics. I don't actually have a memory of how I learned how to spiccato or any particular instruction that I received, so over the course of many years, I've given it a great deal of thought. I've come to an inescapable conclusion. If the basics of bowing are correct, spiccato follows pretty logically and pretty easily. But if there's a flaw in the basic bowing, then spiccato is often extremely difficult and frustrating. Spiccato, as you all know, is a bouncing bow. It's really the combination of two motions. It's a vertical motion combined with a horizontal motion. Now, the horizontal motion is just your normal bowing. Now, the vertical motion is often the challenge. So let's just start with something quite simple as an analogy. If I bounce a basketball just standing still, the ball bounces up and down under my hand. I propel the ball down and the ball bounces up and I propel it down. I can do the same thing with the bow. I can take the bow and I can bounce it up and down like this. And if I add the normal bowing motion to this, I will get a slow bounce. Now notice that slow bounce, I'm doing it pretty close to the frog. So I started just with a vertical bounce, and I added a horizontal motion. So this can be a really easy way to just start to bounce the bow. I know that you're thinking, well, the difficulty comes when you try to go faster, and the difficulty also comes when you try to come from the string into a bounce rather than just dropping the bow into the string. But it's a useful exercise just to get the feeling of bounce. And now, while we're talking about the bounce, I want to go back to the analogy of a ball. Now, if you bounce a ball that has a lot of air in it, it's pumped up really tight, and you drop it onto cement, which is a very hard surface, the bounce will be quite high. The ball will rebound quite high. If, however, you take some air out of the ball, then the ball will begin to bounce lower and lower and lower. But also, if I took a ball that had a lot of air in it, and I dropped it onto a softer surface like grass, it wouldn't bounce as high as bouncing on cement. And I say, why am I talking about this? Well, the cello and the bow are two springy surfaces. First, the hair is quite springy, just like a ball. And the string itself is also a spring. Although it's a stiffer spring, it definitely has bounce to it and springiness. So I've got two surfaces that I need to consider in bouncing. Now, let's just talk about the bow and the angle of the bow and flat hair. If I bounce the bow with flat hair, if I just drop it, you'll notice that it bounces pretty high. Now, if I rotate the stick towards me a little bit, you'll notice immediately that when I drop it, the bounce is much shallower. And if I turn the bow to an extreme angle and drop it, it barely bounces at all. Also, if I repeat the same experiment and I repeat the experiment at the end of the fingerboard, the surface here is softer than the surface closer to the bridge. And I'm just mentioning this, it's not a terribly important factor in the beginning stages of learning spiccato, but for instance, in the Rococo variations, there are some wicked scales in one of the variations that start quite low and end up all the way at the end of the fingerboard. Now, if you maintain the same degree of flatness of the hair the bounce will be way too high when you get into the higher positions. And on the contrary, if you start with the bow too angled in the lower positions, the bow won't bounce at all because the strings, the C string, is very, very flexible. So in order to bounce effectively, we have to start with the bow standing up more on the C string, but by the time we get up high on the A string, we have to turn the bow more on the edge so that the bounce isn't at high. Remember, it's the combination of the two surfaces that determines this. Now, the other important consideration is that the location of spiccato changes according to the speed of spiccato. In other words, location on the bow. If I'm bouncing very, very slowly, I will be close to the frog with very little wrist motion, like this. But as I speed the bow up, the spiccato will progress along the bow to a little bit beyond the middle, depending on the speed. So if I demonstrate that, so you notice that I moved out along the bow according to the speed. This is very important because oftentimes students will attempt to do a slow spiccato too far out on the bow or a fast spiccato too close to the frog. So it's very, very important to experiment not only with the placement but with the angle of the hair until you find a combination that works. Now, I mentioned that you could start learning spiccato by dropping the bow into the string and then adding a horizontal motion. I'd like to demonstrate how that motion, it's actually the combination of two motions. If I put a little chalk mark on my bow, near the point where I'm going to spiccato, I'd like to show two things with this chalk mark. First, that when I'm at speed, that there's very, very small amount of bow being used. And you'll notice, if you blur your eyes a little bit and stare at the chalk mark, you'll notice that you'll see the chalk mark moving in a V shape. So the chalk mark, that means that the spiccato is coming down at this angle to the string and it's rebounding at this angle to the string. So it's coming in at one angle and rebounding at another. To go back to the basketball analogy, if you passed the ball to another player, you would be doing exactly that. You would shoot the ball out across the floor at an angle, and then it would take off towards the player you were passing it to in the opposite direction, but it would go down like this and come up like this. So if you take a look at the chalk mark, you'll see that V shape that I'm talking about. And off the string. At the beginning of my little talk, I said that spiccato bowing is just normal bowing with one very, very small change. It's essentially a legato stroke that you speed up and then you make a slight shift in position of your bow hand and the bow will start bouncing. Now, if all the ingredients are right, this is what happens. And so that's why I talked about all those basic things in the beginning. So let me demonstrate that. I will start with a legato bow stroke, and I will gradually speed it up. You'll notice that I'm going in and out of the string with great ease. Now, this is very important because a lot of times what happens is that spiccato gets completely out of control. The bounce becomes too high, and in an attempt to get the bounce to be more reasonable and lower and closer to the string, I noticed that students oftentimes grip the bow tighter, trying to push it back into the string. But this actually has the opposite effect of what is desired, because you have now made the bow more resilient rather than less resilient, and the bounce becomes higher. And at this point, all control of the spiccato is lost. So the way to control the height of the bounce, one way to control the height of the bounce very easily, is simply to move the angle of the bow, change the angle so that it's leaning more towards you. You're now presenting the cello with a softer amount of hair, the bounce will get lower, and if you turn the bow enough towards you, the bow won't be able to bounce at all. You'll be back on the string, and you'll feel safe. Then you can actually roll the bow out in your hand ever so slightly, and you'll find that the bow comes off. Now you can find a sweet spot there where you get just the right sound that you want. But this is not the only thing that I'm doing in order to achieve a spiccato coming from the string. The essential ingredient for me is that there's a very, very, very slight postural change in my right hand. When I'm bowing in the string, I'm pronating slightly to the left. In other words, I'm adding weight into the stick. There's a slight upward force against my thumb and an inward force due to pronating my forearm. Now, if I maintain this position, which is essentially this, there's no way in the world that the bow could ever bounce. However, do you remember at the beginning I said that when we held the bow like this, we didn't feel that the bow had much weight. And when we turned the bow like this, suddenly we felt the weight of the tip. Now, if I let go of these fingers, then the bow falls in my hand like this. So obviously I'm supporting the weight of the tip by using my third and fourth fingers to provide a little resistance so that the bow doesn't fall out of my hand. When I transition from legato in the string bowing to a spiccato stroke, all I'm doing is I'm centering my hand more on the bow. I'm just sitting back, a millimeter or two, a very small amount, and I'm adding ever so slightly some support with these fingers. It's quite clear that for the bow to bounce, when it's in the air, the bow has to be supported by these fingers. See, when I bounce, if I bounce slowly, I don't get this. I have to support the weight of the bow. In other words, I've got to support the weight of the tip with the back of my hand. And this essentially is the main change from legato bowing to spiccato bowing. So I found that there are a couple of exercises in Popper that actually aid in learning spiccato. Popper 6 and Popper 27 can be played in a very useful manner once these basic ideas are understood. So what I tell my students to do is to play 5 notes on the string and 3 notes off the string. Now the 5th note, which is a down bow, is a transition note that starts on the string down bow, but by the end of the down bow, it has left the string. And so that the next up bow starts from actually above the string. So it's like this. So, this becomes very, very useful because what you really want to feel as a cellist is that you have control of going from on the string to off the string. And once you feel that, then you will have mastered spiccato. I hope you found this useful, and thanks for listening.